Hello, and welcome to my presentation on the effects of the digital revolution on society. Basically, what this slideshow is going to be going over is mass digitalization, the major cascading effects of the fields of the economic industrial side of technology, how technology and economy go hand in hand, because tech does not come from nothing. Technology, as we use it in terms of computers, is one of the most alloyed goods. And so those resources have to come from somewhere. We're going to be looking at the pop culture aspects of technology. So even if we don't understand technology, we can see how the influence of technology, even if it's just a gas, can still give us entertaining stuff. We're going to be looking at the social obligations of technology. Day to day, we interact with technology and how sometimes this tends to be a gripe. And then we're going to be looking at moments where technology has been a downright hindrance towards people, and then we're also going to probably wash that back with the idea of technology is not all bad. There are some technologies that exist that are purely beneficial. We're going to be looking at the cultural rises, attachments to communications technology, i.e. the internet. Now that gives way to some microcosms of culture. And then we're going to be looking at how we end up judging other people based on how they use technology. Why do we need to shout at each other for the different flavors of iPhones or Androids we use? Is it necessary? Why does it happen? Now you may be asking yourself, why would I want to know all of this? And what the information you will be coming from the slide will also probably teach you is that with the wide range of things, you'll probably have a better understanding of how services are delivered from technology. You can understand a bit more about why the guy on the other end of the phone is taking so long to get your internet switched back on. You can understand how some applications of technology become redundant, what might become seen as useless, or maybe not as much needed. A slight bit of the evolution of technology, what computers started as before we even had computers, and how they abstracted on themselves until eventually we got to something that we can fit in our pocket. Hopefully we're going to understand that technology is something that helps us understand patterns. So if we look for patterns in technology or the development of technology, we can hopefully reduce the amount of redundancies. And then of course the jack of all trades, master of none, is sometimes better than a master of one. If you know what you're doing in your field, and you know what you're doing really well, but you aren't aware of other things in the field, then what makes you any more than just a cog in the machine, you tool? So how does this relate to the field of informatics? Well, informatics is the ultimate meshing of technology, business, and communications. And those tend to all branch off directly from the timeline of the start of the digital revolution to today's modern age. And it should be noted that informatics is also focused on the humanitarian aspect of it, because if we can't communicate well enough, then we need to find ways to communicate better. So let's start with the evolution of technology, or how we got to modern computers. Alright, before the 20th century, computers used to be an occupation. It was a job somebody had where they would sit at a desk with a huge piece of paper and they would just crank out math problems, be it for calculating anything from how we're going to get a rocket up into the air to calculating the US Census. And this ended up being so slow, it would have taken like way more time than it would be useful to calculate something like the US Census. Typically in this position you would use something like an abacus. What an abacus is, nowadays it's been reduced to a little toy that you mess with in the lobby of a hospital or a nurse's office. Those colorful little beads that you slide along a rack, those used to be used by calculators or mathematicians to be able to keep track of better mentally decimal places for solving math problems. More mechanical approach, you had adding machines, which were more akin to calculators shoved into typewriters, where you would punch into keys the values of numbers, and then you'd crank a lever, and then that would give you your value. At some point, though, the occupation wasn't enough. We needed machines to be able to do these processes faster than just a calculator, an adding machine, or an abacus. So you would use more applied physical processes and mechanical movements of components such as vacuum tubes, magnetic tapes, and then punch cards. Vacuum tubes were very tedious to replace. You'd have to dig into the computer and then pop them out and put them back in. Magnetic tapes are very volatile in that the more you played them back, the more the data started to become warped on them. And also, because they were magnetic, if you brought just like an ordinary magnet to magnetic tape, all the poles within the magnets would end up pointing upwards, making the data blank. Punch cards, back in the day, if you wanted to write a program for a computer or just any sort of code to be replicated to take to other computers, punching out holes in the cards, that would be your program. If the computer could connect through those holes, matching through the patterns would be the equivalent of the data you would get out of the computer. Fun fact, if you took a blank punch card and then you punched out all of the holes, the piece of paper being inserted to the machine would end up being so flimsy, it would end up crumpling inside the computer. This would disable a computer for so long that you'd have to crack it open and then take out all the little bits of paper with tweezers. And then by that time that you got the computer repaired, Ivan would have already launched his satellites into space before you. Because mechanical and physical movements were so volatile, though, we ended up coming to electrical impulses and solid-state hardware for representing values with bits. You'd have a row of numbers that were 16 digits wide, 32 digits wide, and if you had some really expensive resources to disperse, 64 bits. All this meant is that you had bigger space in binary to represent numbers and values for symbols. Digital technology ended up being so amazing and mainstream with being replicated anymore that eventually we got to home computers. So basically anybody's family could buy something akin to a Commodore 64 or a Macintosh, and typically these home computers would have commercial operating systems and softwares in them. And these would end up going on to be what we would use to write instructions to keeping track of data ourselves, or even produce our own data in our own programs. And then at the end of the spectrum, what we have now is technology that has been compacted so much that we just carry it around in our pockets with smartphones and personal devices. The main trade-off of these devices being that because they are more convenient, we are not so much using them to write instructions for programming and processing of data. We're more closed source, and we're more using them to keep track of data, such as calendar dates, and keep messaging our friends onto the industrial and economic part of it. Where do the materials come from? What is the pipeline of making a computer? Most computers are made out of highly conductive metals for the circuitry and other components, those metals being copper, silver, and gold. Typically, we would know these materials as being highly marked up for jewelry, but jewelry tends to be pretty useless other than vanity. These materials are still highly marked up for computing and making of computer circuits, but at least you get a bit more utility, at least in processing information out of computers, so I'd say the trade-off is a bit more better and justified. You have structures made from non-conductive or organic materials such as silicone, which is like a putty-like insulation that you cannot get on your pants, or else it does not come out in the wash. I would know from burying phone cables with my cousin. You'd have rubber, which is famously and classically one of the least conductive materials you would have, and that's used for wire insulation. Then you would get to tetracyanaqui-dimethane, or the forbidden orange salt, which is highly toxic to get on your skin, or ingest for that matter. And I believe this is something that is used for eventually making the circuit boards with that classic orange or even green color. I also want to include a quick note here that machine parts for computers are small and delicate. Please treat them with care. Stop dropping your phones on the ground. Alright, it disrupts the circuitry inside. You can't peel a compact disc out of a crystal, otherwise you bend the disc and it might corrupt it or crack the disc, and that ruins the data. So where do we get these materials from? For the conductive metals, we would get them from quarries. For the rubber and the silicone, we would get it from rubber trees. Yes, rubber comes from trees, from the sap. The trees themselves are not made of rubber. Calm down. After all of this, we would have either assembly lines, or more realistically, because these computer parts tend to be made with components so fine and small, you'd have Chinese children in Africa in sweatshops putting these together. Alright, so we've put together a computer, right? Are we going to use it? Yes. Are we going to use it too much? Most likely, yes. Wants and need is met. We tend to go overboard. We spent so much time getting to making the computers that we're now producing them at a rate that is more than what we need. Excess. Oh my. You certainly don't see that in America. This is what ends up forming the obligations to use that technology, even if we don't necessarily want to use it anymore. And this is where redundancies start showing through sometimes. This is something I've personally experienced. Even back from 5th or 6th grade, our schools would use iPads. And then, of course, nobody was fully aware of how to use the iPads, not even the teachers that issued them to us. And then later, when I got into the last few years of high school, they would have us use MacBooks, which I was surprised at, because even if they were closed source, you'd still potentially have that one kid who is really smart enough to know how to get a malicious program into, or be able to write a malicious program for something like a MacBook. With dumb high school kids, the chances are slim, but there's, again, if something can go wrong, it probably will. Speaking of businesses, how many times have you done this? You call up because your Wi-Fi isn't working, you need to renew your driver's license or your banking information. So you call the number through the app thinking you can get a bit more advice and tell somebody on the other end to fix your problem. You get redirected to an automated phone menu, and you have to sit there and listen to the robotic voice on the other end tell you all the options just so you can hopefully get to the end and tell you which number to dial so that you can talk to a real human being. This one's a bit more forgivable because realistically, the number of employees working for your businesses is probably going to be way, way smaller marginally compared to the number of customers you will be servicing. So of course we're going to need automatic menus to step in and probably help our people first before we can get a person within the company to help them directly. But let's say, all right, you got your Wi-Fi working. What are you going to do with it now? I know. Let's include home applications such as refrigerators and cooking grills that can connect to the Wi-Fi. Why would we need to do this? I'm not sure. Sometimes people like to play Spotify off of their smart fridges anymore, I guess. Sometimes people want to be able to connect their grill to Bluetooth because they want to be able to sit upstairs and they want to be able to have a notification that goes off when their ribs are done being smoked, I guess. Whereas before, the appliance worked fine on its own when you were standing next to it, and then sometimes this is seen as a redundancy because it's not a necessity for technology. We just happen to have so much of it now that we might as well be shoving it into our refrigerators. Alright, appliances, that is still also part of a necessity. Let's focus on the phones. What do we use on the phones? We use social medias. Even the phones themselves, because of how fancy tech they are, they end up coming in with all these little caveats of technology that we still aren't aware of. Nowadays, businesses are going to need to collect data based on how you use their technology in order to better their technology. And this ends up being included in terms of service documents. Famously, people tend to not read these. Despite this, though, companies will still end up coming under scrutiny. Even after nobody read the documents, they ended up being too vague in how they conveyed how they would end up being using your data. And even after that, if they were just using your data in some sort of malicious form in the first place, they're still going to end up getting found out at some point, probably. Famously, Mark Zuckerberg has been up in the defensive chair so many times, sweating bullets, drinking water, having to answer to lawyer after lawyer what this data is being used for. There might be a bit of justice there, but by far probably the most daunting use of technology. It's not just an obligation anymore. This is a direct thing that is being forced onto citizens, is the Great Chinese Internet Firewall. All of the internet in China has to go through a process by which it is monitored and censored. You will not be able to find things on Chinese internet that tells you how to start a revolution, how the government is crappy, and other things such as. And beyond this, you have the Chinese social credit system that impedes the liberties of citizens by giving a direct value to what their citizens do. There's a value assigned to the political opinions of citizens. There's a value assigned to the shopping habits of citizens. And based on what your social credit is, you will have certain rights taken away from you, and you will not have permissions to do certain things within society. And beyond all of this, it's even become a common major concern within the realm of mental health that probably the ill use of looking at screens and flashing lights for too long, probably let alone isn't doing anything good to our eyeballs, but is probably the information we're reading about is doing some pretty wacky stuff to our brains. making them not work, so no good. Alright, so the microcosms of internet culture. We use the internet as basically this huge mass communication tool. Social medias like Instagram try to pride themselves on being more expressive and quick. Trends tend to pick up and then die out pretty quickly. One example might be a recent dance somebody thought was cool on TikTok, and then you get Paul pulled into the principal's office being like, why did you act this way? And then he says, well, I saw somebody do it on TikTok. I thought it was kind of cool. Those are a dime a dozen. But still, what you can see here is a very quick spread of changes in behavior from the influence of communication. Then you'll have forum areas like 4chan or Doom World, which usually try to focus on specific themes and then allow you to go into more lengthy discussions around those themes. Doom World is a community for making maps for Doom, which is a video game. 4chan is a board that has all sorts of forum topics, from anime to wallpapers to how guns work. And if you want to look up there and see how an AR-15 fires, because maybe you're a terrorist, maybe you just like the mechanics of how guns fire, I'm not sure. Have fun. These communities at one point or another will start developing new terminologies for words to be able to communicate that information faster. And what you'll end up having is a phenomenon in which there is, yes, a new culture that forms, and if you are not part of that culture, you will end up hearing a bunch of words that sound like crazy mishmash. Another thing I should probably also mention is that existing words can have their meanings tweaked slightly as well. For instance, the word handle, block, or even cloud. Handle is not just referring to the handle of a suitcase. Handle is now used to be like a pseudonym. The cloud, the glorious cloud, everybody likes the cloud because you don't have to spend resources on computation yourself. And then even if you're not giving any input whatsoever, you'll still have information pages or encyclopedic pages that are basically just long papers that people have written themselves or with help from their other friends that just dump all the information onto you. These are websites like Wikipedia or the medical journals or news websites. Of course, something you will end up seeing when cultures start to form, and like I said earlier, you will have different cultures that end up making different words that sound like hogwash to each other. What you end up having is judgment. Now, how we end up using technology is also something to be judged. Usually it ends up being the utility. Sometimes it's just the preference of how the device feels. With Macs versus PCs, which desktop is more efficient for programming and instructions, organizing files, media interaction. With our more convenient smartphone devices like Apple versus Android, people are more worried about how well is the picture going to look when I take a picture on my phone? What do the apps interfaces look like? How well can I interface to find apps? How quickly can I click on the Instagram icon to make the little numbers go up? It's not just what types of technologies we use as well, but even how often or how not we use technology. My own math tutor has lamented to me a few times, I believe at this point, how he has young students who will immediately pull up a calculator to add two single-digit numbers together, which shows that youths may have accelerated learning on how technology does work, but still end up forming a dependency. And finally, we get to the fun part, the pop culture of technology, in which nothing is real anymore, nothing makes sense, and this is all for entertainment. That being said, though, most early theories put forth by scientists and early philosophers on the late stages of technological advancement have been taken as inspiration for these fictitious books, movies, and other sorts of stories. The genre of cyberpunk is specifically used to refer to the fact that later stage technology, it takes root in absolutely everything. You know how people complain nowadays that kids don't know how to put down phones and they're always sucked into it? At least they have the liberty to physically put down the phone and they will be away from it anymore. Cyberpunk refers to the point in society where it is mandated that you get your cell phone directly implanted into your brain. This is the society where everybody has robotic arms. This is the society where most of our politics anymore probably aren't even politics, and they're just computers deciding where we end up going in society. Do androids dream of electric sheep or Ghost in the Shell? These are stories that focus around how human intelligence could be replicated by machines or technology, and how ethically we should treat these, should they be treated as other people. Do androids dream of electric sheep? Famously, the novel that influenced the Blade Runner movies. In this one, the empathy is pretty good. It's portrayed in such a way where it almost seems like it's not even a question anymore. Of course these are people. We want to give them the best. We want to give them some sort of chance. But then again, that is empathy. We will get back to that later. Ghost in the Shell is named after a psychological theory or phenomenon or thought experiment in which people think that the process of consciousness is something that is separate from the biological and physical processes of the human body. Take with that what you will. And again, if we could replicate human consciousness, then what is to say we can't trick human consciousness? Which brings us to the Matrix. This could be akin to the brain in a jar thought experiment or simulation theory, basically saying that sometimes our brains can come up with really powerful thoughts, but there's no way for us to just think a jar to open. We'd have to get up and physically move our hands. How do we know we're really moving our hands? We are perceiving ourselves moving our hands are touching it, and we're getting sensory information. Again, this is to say all of this in simulation theory could just be, impulses replicated as you decide to do it, giving you the feedback you want. And it comes from the idea that nothing outside of your own conscious experiences can really be known. So what is to say you are not living in a simulation? The Terminator franchise. You know that thing I said earlier? The empathy is pretty good. Well, sometimes it's not human intelligence, sometimes it's just intelligence of machines that need to keep going because they were assigned points values that tell them rewards. If you ask me, this ends up being a more realistic approach to how technology works. In that technology needs to grow, there's always a factory that needs to grow, there's always a demand that needs to be met, and sometimes if we give self-awareness to the computers, they're going to start thinking, well, hey, why don't we just use some of this self-preservation for ourselves, because that gives us more opportunity to complete the task, which gives us more reward, and it's supposed to be this whole feedback cycle. This would be akin more to a tree growing out of control and all the roots killing your garden, rather than a robot being made in the lab that just wants to be treated like a human. Rocco's Basilisk is basically, if you've seen Terminator, you get the gist of this. If an artificial intelligence at some point in the future was smart enough to understand the logistics behind time travel and then eventually apply that the AI would be able to go back in time and basically alter history to absolutely ensure that the AI can come about. And of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger was gracious enough to try to take up this role for a moment to show us what that might look like in all of its badassitude. And then you have the movie Antitrust. This is less about what late-stage technology does to you, and this is more about where late-stage technology would be heading. The movie revolves around what would be a Bill Gates stand-in, basically hiring assassins to chase after the competition of his company, killing them off, and then stealing their ideas for software to put into his computers to be able to sell them back, eliminating the competition. And this is where the name antitrust comes in. Antitrust laws in our economy are why there's a Shell gas station next to a Lassus, next to a BP oil. Antitrust is why you can have a McDonald's on one side of the street, and then you go 2 to 3 blocks down, and then you'll find a Burger King. Basically, there needs to be competition within a capitalist society, because without competition, it gives rise to monopolies, which back in the 1950s, after the Great Depression, we decided were all bad. So we tried to do away with predatory market practices, basically being slander. You could just be one company and saying, oh, the other company has a really crappy product. Their product gives you skin cancer. Our product gives you young, soft, supple, refreshing skin. Companies cannot do that anymore, or at least cannot be as directly slanderous. That being said, monopolies probably might still end up happening, basically in a more slower, insidious way of approaching it. And again, technology does not come from nothing. Technology does not come from the stork. These technologies need to come from resources, which feeds back into the economy. And one last note I should tell you is that, these are all fictitious events. These are all just for entertainment. So if you happen to be a college student going for an associate's in computer science, I am sorry to tell you, but at some point you might have to break away from these in order to look at the actual applications of technology. Now, to quickly summarize everything, computers have gone from a job that somebody has to perform to the need eventually giving rise to machines that do the tasks for us. Imagine in before the 20th century, if you wanted to play Minecraft and you had to have each computer, as in the person, manually read through the papers and then have to interpret the data for you, including all the render passings, all of the behaviors of mobs or whatever. It'd be a nightmare. And because of the evolution of technology, we've needed to apply more and more industry and materials to be able to create more complex machines. While some technology can still be a pure benefit, redundancy can occur when technology is in excess and you don't need to necessarily put complex computation of data into an object. Putting a computer into your toilet or your looking glasses isn't necessarily going to make them better. We've been communicating through the internet for so long that we tend to change around or even invent new words. And between using the internet for purely expression, or just for information, or even utilizing technology at all, and to what degree we use technology can make us open to judgment, because of course somebody's going to come along and tell us, hey, you're doing that task wrong, or you could be doing it better, or such and such. And while science fiction and cyberpunk can give us some cool ideas for reviving old theories that late scientists had, they're ultimately pipe dreams anymore. And just because a theory put forth is super high concept doesn't mean that automatically makes it more applied or more plausible. If anything, the opposite is true. You're relying upon more moving parts and you're opening more spaces to be wrong about something. I have hired this cat to stare at you. And that concludes my presentation. These are some of the citations I used in these presentations to gather information. Thank you very much.